Ladies and gentlemen, welcome wrestling fans worldwide to Knoxville and the Great Smoky Mountains for the Ron Fuller, Tennessee Studcast.
6 feet 9 inches tall, 265 pounds.
This historic podcast from one of the most respected and successful wrestlers and promoters will follow the footsteps of the largest and oldest wrestling family on the planet.
Listen to what I'm saying. That's right. Bring that camera in here a little bit closer.
Through 93 years and 4 generations.
The stud has arrived.
Old school or new fan, this unique broadcast will educate and captivate as Ron details decades of professional wrestling's growth with truly unforgettable stories.
I want those people out there at home to hear the stud.
Sit back and enjoy the ride with the Tennessee Stud.
The Tennessee Stud. You will learn that name. You will remember it.
And now,
the stud is here.
Hey everybody, welcome in. It's David Summers hosting another Studcast with the Tennessee Stud, Ron Fuller. This is the story of wrestling in America as told by the Stud, whose family started the profession over 100 years ago. So let's step back into the ring, back into time, as we get wall-to-wall and treetop tall with the Tennessee Stud, Ron Fuller. Hey Ron, I got to tell you what, your Studcast is really becoming an all-time favorite for a lot of folks out there. You've been on a roll lately, and the Farmer Burns story from back in the 1880s, believe it or not, about becoming the world champion by building the size of his neck and learning to hang himself just to win the world championship, catch as catch can, professional wrestling championship. Okay, once again, you've broken record, Stud.
Yeah, thank you very much, man. I really enjoyed that, man. I mean, what some tremendous history that is. The story alone, Dave, proves a dedication to the sport and just how far some wrestlers went to get to the top. Martin Farmer Burns, to me, is one of the greatest stories in the history of the sport. And this hidden history lesson that we're going to be doing here today in this Studcast is, in my opinion, right up there with the Burns story, if not even better than the Burns story.
You know, when I saw the picture last week on your social media, I thought, wait, what is this, from a horror movie? Because, I mean, this dude is hanging, and it's definitely a throwback picture, and I had to look at it a couple of times. It's unbelievable that he had this ability. So these hidden history lessons have been awesome since the very first one you did a couple of months ago. All right, I know you got another one today, but how are you gonna top that from the one last week?
Oh well, man, we're going to do our best. I definitely think I can and will, man, with this one, Dave. Today's lesson is going to be about how everything in professional wrestling changed in the early 1920s. And I mean literally everything. Professional wrestling by the 1920s had enjoyed basically about 60 years of legitimacy, going back to the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, who was actually a great wrestler himself, quite a wrestler himself. He had a tremendous record as a wrestler. So I highly recommend those that want to know more about the sport's real history to Google wrestling in the 1800s. Wow, there's so much information there. And so much of it is like Farmer Burns hanging himself. Who goes to that extreme to win a world championship? To get to where he can hang himself. And he knew that once this guy hooks that hold on him again, that he's not going to beat him anymore. Because if he can hang himself and survive it, he could certainly survive the guy's hold. So it's been really good. It's been interesting for me piecing all these stories together. Former wrestlers like myself, we owe so much of those in the distant past that in this time frame that sacrificed so much more than wrestlers did after 1920. Things are going to change here in this Studcast, and it gives those fans that take the time to find out a much greater appreciation for wrestling, for the forefathers of our wrestling day from days and days, way back in time. We owe a lot to all those guys.
Oh, no doubt. I don't know anyone that could be more determined than a person like Farmer Burns, and you should be honored to in any way have a connection to him through his having trained the original Dutch Mantell who actually trained your grandfather, Roy Welch. All right, Stud, so where are we riding today?
Well, man, we're going to ride in the third decade of the 20th century for this week's hidden history lesson. And this is going to be the decade my grandfather became a professional wrestler. And that opened the door for so many more of the people in my family that followed along in his footsteps. And we're going to find out why they did it, who they were, the people that made this happen in 1920. Basically, it started about 1920, and how they actually changed professional wrestling forever. So then we're going to race forward, man, to about 60 years down there to the Gulf Coast in Pensacola, Florida. We're going to be in the Southeastern Gulf Coast territory, and we're going to find out what was happening there in the second week of March, 1980. So we're jumping 60 years one direction and 60 years another, man. It's pretty crazy in this one. So the three major cities, Mobile, Montgomery, and Dothan, they had a great card and TV, and they were going to continue. That card was going to continue the success the territory was currently having at that point. It was really on fire. And we're going to talk about the matches as a result of the card in those three cities and the attendances in those three markets we'll talk about. And then hopefully we're going to have another chance for a learning tree question, Dave.
All right, good deal. Sounds like a perfect plan to me. I can't wait to find out exactly who, why, and how professional wrestling changed forever.
Well, it kind of all began with three wrestlers, man. Toots Mondt and Billy Sandow were also both promoters as well as wrestlers. And the third wrestler in this combination was the world heavyweight champion, Ed Strangler Lewis, the pivotal figure, basically, in this three combination in what's going to be called the Goldust Trio. And between 1920 and 1928, these three guys changed literally everything about professional wrestling. So let's begin with who was behind the dramatic changes in the sport. So Robert Herman Julius Frederick, better known as Ed Strangler Lewis, and I guess if I had four names, I would, anything's probably better than that. So he's better known as Ed Strangler Lewis, and he's the first one I want to talk about.
All right, just 1 second. I hate to interrupt, but was he in any relation to Evan Strangler Lewis, the wrestler that Farmer Burns beat in last week's Studcast to win the world championship?
That's a great question. I mean, yeah, it's pretty close to exactly the same name. So, and I asked myself that when I saw this and when I was doing the research. So no, he was not related, but he used the name for one reason, Ed Strangler, for one reason is because he was fond of Evan Strangler Lewis. He knew that history of the guy back in the 1880s, and so it was mostly to hide but he mostly did this because he didn't want his mother and father to know what he was doing. So don't get me wrong, Dave. When he grew up, he was in no way a mother and father's baby. He wasn't a baby boy. He was 5 feet 10 inches tall. He weighed 265 pounds.
Wow.
He was far larger than the normal wrestler.
I'll say.
Ed Strangler Lewis. In fact, he was 100 pounds heavier than my grandfather Roy.
Wow.
So Strangler Lewis wrestled more than 6,000 matches in his career, most of which were real. And he lost only 32 of those 6,000 matches. He was trained by Farmer Burns, and he was one of the most important of the three men in the Goldust Trio. After forming their company with his size and skills, they could put the title on whoever they wanted because Lewis could beat anybody. And And especially if they didn't follow the script or, they didn't do what they were supposed to do in the ring. And therefore, they had complete control of the world championship. So Lewis, following in the footsteps of Farmer Burns, then went and he trained Lou Thez and Danny Hodge and many of the other big names in the business. And he was great friends, very close friends with my grandfather, Roy. So, Strangler Lewis won the world title for the first time on December the 13th in 1920. His two partners, they both wrestled, and they had both, like I mentioned earlier, been promoters. Toots Mondt was a former carnival wrestling star who was also trained by Farmer Burns, oddly enough. Farmer Burns trained supposedly 1,000 wrestlers. And in fact, Burns recommended to Toots Mondt that he join the camp of Ed Strangler Lewis because he knew what Lewis was going to try to put together. So later on, Toots is going to be kind of responsible for the routines and the finishes that were going to be determined and that were going to be used in wrestling in the future. So the last of the trio, named Billy Sandow, and he helped Lewis develop his headlock. And Lewis was famous for this headlock, and it was said, Dave, that he had a skull made that he could put underneath his arm like a man's head, and actually could crush this skull so that obviously he had a hold that if you got your headlock on you, you were done. It was the end of the match, and I don't doubt that he could have crushed a man's skull if he really wanted to.
Wow.
So now you know the players here. So let's find out why they needed to change the game, right? That's basically what they did. So as the 1920s dawned, wrestling's popularity was, oddly enough, it was dying at this point. And it was dying because it was these long, extremely long matches and this slow style that the sport had. The action was confined to the mat, and because the wrestlers were shooting, and most matches were lasting at least an hour. We talked about one last week that lasted 2 hours before they even got off their feet. So, it was just it was kind of a boring sport because guys were having to, when they were shooting, they were having to make sure they didn't get beat quickly by making some crazy mistake. So almost every card had only one event on it back in those days, which meant there were just two wrestlers going to be seen in as many as 3 hours, right? You sit there. Can you imagine that? It'd be difficult, right, Dave?
Yeah, for real.
Watch three-hour match.
Yeah. Wow.
So there was a lot of things that needed to change around 1920. Rings needed to be modernized. They needed to be softened up so that they could prevent injuries that came from taking bumps. Guys couldn't take bumps because the rings were just like concrete. So maybe most of all, though, I think the problem with the sport was facing back in those days came from actually the people, the citizens themselves. The upcoming attitude of the time was reflected basically in the term that was going to lead the way for basically that country that had been a calm, that totally different atmosphere in the 1910s to 1920, but now we're getting into the Roaring 20s. So, that name in itself said a lot about what was going to happen to wrestling. It was going to become roaring itself. So the Gold Dust Trio, they seemed to have it all figured out, man. They knew exactly how they wanted to change the sport and exactly how they wanted to modernize pro wrestling. So they began by forming their own promotion company, first thing. That was going to actually employ significantly more wrestlers than had ever been used before. Back in the 1880s and early 1900s, there weren't a lot of wrestlers out there. So, there wasn't but there was a lot of interest in it, and a lot of people wanted to get involved in it. So once they formed this promotion company, and they decided they were going to expand, hundreds of wrestlers flocked to them. Guys that had wanted to learn to wrestle, now they're going to get the training. And these guys were seeking the opportunity to make a living in the sport, something that had never been possible in the shoot era, because, the shooters, there were only just so many of them, and they were always against each other. So this is really one of the big first changes. And then immediately they started hiring wrestlers, and they hired guys to work exclusively for them. And in that process, they became their own booking agencies for wrestlers. Wrestlers then were under their control, and they could book them wherever they wanted to. They worked when they wanted them to, and they worked where they wanted them to. So they moved the events basically out of the carnivals. We talked about that in the last couple of Studcasts. Yeah, the carnivals was a part of wrestling, early wrestling. And these guys dished the carnivals. They got rid of the carnivals. And they used to have wrestling in these cheap little burlesque theaters. And they got away from that, and they started booking wrestling into major arenas. So they shortened the matches, and they lengthened the cards. That created for the first time undercard matches. There had never been more than two guys in these big cards. Now there's maybe four guys underneath those two guys. And they always made sure that they had at least two matches with two different sets of wrestlers on every card. So that was another major change that they introduced. They introduced time limit matches, no contest matches, count outs, double count outs, time limit draws, body slams, suplexes, and punches. I mean, it was crazy, right? So they realized that someone then needed to beat the champion every once in a while. Because, right? I mean, it had to happen because, if the champion never got beat, why go see him after a while?
It's just the same old, yeah.
There you go. Yeah. So, these guys were with it, man. They had their stuff together, man. So they realized that the champion needed to get beat. And so occasionally Ed Strangler Lewis would drop the belt on somebody else. And that would lead to what was called storylines, rivalries, long programs, return matches, a series of matches, working feuds, and natural rivalries. I mean, that opened the door to so many other possibilities in the sport. So then they redesigned, finally, wrestling rings so that they'd have less resistance than the boxing rings. Wrestlers were having to use boxing rings. And boxing rings have to be very firm because of the style of the sport. Wrestling rings don't need to be firm because you're going to be slammed and you're going to it's a different sport than boxing. So they redesigned wrestling rings to be wrestling rings and to allow wrestlers to take bigger and better bumps without injury. So matches basically became what Toots Mondt called slam bang Western style matches. That was what he wanted to see in the rings at this point. So they went in a totally new direction and began to recruit and train big name football players from major colleges. But the biggest change they made, and I think was probably the best thing they did, is they slowly and eventually started having predetermined matches. Didn't happen overnight. It was a slow thing, and fans didn't really know what was happening, but they knew that they were seeing something totally different.
Wow, Stud, you were right. I mean, all that really did change the sport forever. They were really taking care of business, and they did this all over the country.
Yeah, they certainly did. And in fact, all over North America, including Canada and Mexico. In only 6 months after they started this process, they controlled wrestling everywhere. but it only lasted until 1928, and at that point, it all basically fell apart.
Wow. Okay, I don't understand that part, and I guess my biggest thing is, wow, all of this took place in the 1920s, and it seems to me like a lot of the rules that they developed or said, let's do this or don't do that, are still in effect today. So really absolutely fascinating stuff. This was a critical time for professional wrestling. Was it going to remain real or become what it did? So how do you think it affected your family, Ron, for the following approximately 60 years, let's say from 1930 to 1988 when you left the sport?
Well, that's a great question. I never really sat down to think about it. I guess if the Gold Dust Trio had not come along, professional wrestling might still today be real, right? It could have, these guys changed it from real to being what it is now. But if they hadn't come along, maybe professional wrestling, if they hadn't come along, would have been the UFC of today.
Yeah.
It could have been.
Yeah.
It's a possibility, right?
Yeah.
So, I never really thought about it. So, you'd been, it affected my family in a heck of a lot of ways. I mean, it would have been totally different. Not every member of my family could have been a wrestler because some of the guys in the family were smaller. And, so if it had been real and had not changed like it did, that would have made it a lot different for my family. And so that would have changed the direction for sure.
Wow.
So as it happened, man, the direction it went probably had a great future for all the people in my family. It was a wonderful ride for us, for not only my family, but for millions and millions of fans who might have preferred it to be real. But they enjoyed it tremendously, man, as it was. So I suppose that's a question that I'm not going to be able to ever answer, really. I can't, I suppose, man, to be honest with you, figure that one out.
Well, and to me, and you tell me what you think, down the line you had such showmen like Gorgeous George and Gorgeous George Jr. who paraded to the ring in really elaborate robes and brought a whole nother dimension to wrestling. What do you think? I mean, what do you think?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you would have lost that. You would have never had that.
Yeah, they wouldn't have been UFC style. Wearing
no,
just,
that they would. I don't think that would have been a UFC style thing.
No.
Closest thing I could think of being that would be Adrian Street. I mean,
right,
Adrian dressed in the exotic outfits.
Yes,
and he looked like a Gorgeous George. But when the bell rang, he was a wrestling son of a gun, right? I mean, so maybe Adrian Street might have been a real sensation UFC.
Yeah, wow. I tell you, this topic has really been amazing to hear how everything in professional wrestling changed in less than 10 years and went on to become what it did. To me, something very few of us ever knew. So your grandfather, Roy, entered into this really thriving business environment in Columbus, Ohio in 1924. So how long did he stay there?
Well, I'm going to have one more hidden history lesson about all this next week. I've been thinking about this and, was going to try to get to Roy this week, but I don't think I'm going to be able to do that. And I'm sure you noticed, Dave, that everything busted for the Gold Dust Trio in 1928. And that year was only 1 year away from the beginning of the Great Depression. So, I mean, it could have even had something to do with their falling apart, basically, is because the Great Depression was on the horizon, and that sure changed everything for everybody, everywhere. So my grandfather was a very serious businessman. He had about 4 years from 1924 until this crash of all of this. He went to work for these guys. They hired him as one of their wrestlers. And so he worked for them for 4 years until that all turned sour and kind of all fell apart. So he was a businessman. And in those 4 years, he really paid attention to how they did all the things they were doing, from running the towns to running the territory. And so in the next Studcast, I think I'm going to follow Roy in the ring, man, and into the sport's darkest days in our country's history, man, the Great Depression.
Well, interesting. I tell you, these hidden history lessons, so interesting, plus such an integral part of wrestling history. All right, before the break, Ron, are you ready to ride into the Southeastern Gulf Coast wrestling part of this Studcast? And if so, can you give us the card? Let's go to Mobile, Alabama, Tuesday, March 11th, 1980.
All right, man, let's do it. So this card was basically in all three of the major markets, Montgomery, Mobile, and Dothan. Opening match was Roy Lee Welch against the Masked Avenger. Then Eddie Boulder was facing the newcomer. We talked about it last week, Dr. Bill Irwin. The third match had Charlie Cook against Norvell Austin. The next match was a return match from the week before. Joe Leduc was against Don Fargo. And this time it was going to be a no disqualification match. And the United States Junior Heavyweight Championship is going to be on the line again. Tony Charles had regained the belt, but Randy Rose stole it after the match. And that fact was going to lead to a very special stipulation that's going to be added in the TV show that we're going to get to when we come back in the second half about this situation between Tony Charles and Randy Rose. Robert and I had won the Southeastern Tag Championship the week before from Jimmy Golden and Norvell Austin. And the Big C had gone out there and was in their corner, and Jimmy had selected the Big C this time to be his partner because Norvell had lost the match the week before. So Jimmy's going to partner up with Big C, and we're going to give them a shot at the tag belts. And then the last match was again for the Southeastern Championship, Mongolian Stomper, managed by Don Carson, against the Georgia Jawjacker. But this time, that match was going to be a no disqualification in it too, according to the contract.
All right, cool deal. All right, so another great card, but with an extra match, which brings it to 7 matches in all. 3 championships at stake, a no disqualification match between Leduc and Fargo, and 3 great opening matches. Okay, so the bell rings for that action. When we come back, we'll find out what was on the TV to promote that card. Let's take a break on this Studcast. Don't leave. All right, folks, on the break, let's talk about the best in old school wrestling. You're going to find it on YouTube, Southeastern Rewind. All right, another Ask the Stud question and answer show is on the way. All right, Ron, tell us about it. What's going on?
Yeah. I want to take a couple of minutes here, or just a little bit of time, to talk about these things that have become so popular today. But it's really amazing to me. People just really love these shows, and this is the 15th one. And if you'd like to leave a question, you can do that. Still, you'll have a couple of days before we get to this is going to air on Saturday, the 16th of March. And if you'd like to leave a question, you can go to the Ron Fuller, Tennessee Stud site, and leave your question there, or you can leave it on Twitter or X, whatever it's called at this point, and we'll get the answering as many as we can for you. And I really enjoy these programs. I love these programs, being able to answer questions for fans. And this is going to be the 15th one, and so don't forget, join us Saturday for it. And if you want to get your questions in, you got a couple of days from when this Studcast actually first starts airing.
Hey, that's cool. By the way, about how many questions are you able to get time to answer during one of these?
It's normally somewhere between 10 and 15. So, and that's what it's basically been about for all 14 of these.
Yeah.
And so I anticipate it'll probably be somewhere similar to that, but we never have the same questions. That's a great part about it. There's never the same question.
That's cool. And by the way, so if they're hearing this today, which is Wednesday today, is March 13th. They still have time to get a question in, and how would they do that?
Yeah, they just go to Ron Fuller, the Tennessee Stud Facebook site, my Facebook site there, and leave your questions there. And or you can go to the Twitter. Look for me on X. I have a post on there that says leave your questions there. And so I can still if you can get the questions in by Friday, I just about get them on the show possibly.
You know, I think that is so cool for this show, but you answered no matter what on your social media. Anybody that asks, hey, Stud, you always respond to everything, and that's really why you sort of turned this into a show.
Yeah, I mean, so many people are asking questions all the time. I figure, I might as well do a show and give a lot of people the opportunity to hear the answers to a lot of questions. Gosh knows that people have really, really gotten into wrestling over the years, and wow, it's quite an honor to be able to, and it's wonderful that I got to do so many things in the sport that I can answer so many questions. I kind of did a little bit of all of it.
And I think it's cool that anybody can reach out and talk to a wrestling legend. That is so cool. Okay, this coming Saturday on YouTube, Southeastern Rewind. Go to YouTube on the search bar, put in Southeastern Rewind. It's the first thing that comes up. Ask the Stud, number 15, this coming Saturday. All right, Studcast fans, welcome back in. Episode number 341. Every one of these, 1 hour or more. That's incredible. 341 of the. How many did you? Is this like 6 years and still counting, Stud?
Oh yeah, man.
Yeah,
we're heading into the 7th year.
Yeah, and that's every week except maybe 2 weeks in 6 years is all I can recall. This episode is called Gold Dust Trio Changes Everything, and 1920. By the way, a footnote. I want to ask. Gold Dust Trio has nothing to do with the modern day, let's say, WWE wrestler known as Gold Dust, Dustin Rhodes.
Yeah, no, it certainly doesn't. I mean, actually, if you think about it,
I bet that's where he got
these it. These guys turned wrestling into gold. That's what they did.
Right.
The three of them, and because there were three of them, they got that nickname, the Gold Dust Trio. And wow, it was very fitting.
I bet that's where McMahon stole it and then put it on Dustin Rhodes.
Could be, man.
That's my opinion. All right, anyway. All right, so this TV had to have a lot happening that we're about to be talking about because you had a 7-card match. So we want to know who all was on this card as we go to Mobile, Alabama. Lay it out for us.
Well, it was loaded, man, that's for sure. Joe Leduc opened the TV show on the set with Charlie, and they watched the end of his match from Montgomery, Alabama. We had recorded a match from Montgomery. We tried to do that every once in a while in other cities, and that had been recorded on a Monday night before this TV show aired. And Joe, for the first time, was facing the crazy, I don't know any other word to use for him, but Don Fargo was nuts. And, so Joe was wrestling for the first time against Don Fargo. And Joe told Charlie that he didn't know much about the history of Don Fargo until after this match, because he said it was the first one that he had ever had with Fargo. So actually, he had no way really to know a lot about him. So he said he was very surprised by the toughness of Don Fargo. He says, wow, this guy's he's a contender. And he said, Charlie, I underestimated him. I'll be honest. And he goes, and actually he busted me open and he had me bleeding right away. And he goes, wow. And I want to do it again. Joe was that type of guy. If he got to a great opponent, he wanted to make sure that he could beat the guy. So he said, I wanted to do it again. So he goes, he got disqualified, and he goes, I want to wrestle him again. And he goes, this time it's going to be a little different. If he says, there's going to be somebody bleeding, but it ain't going to be me this time, Charlie. He goes, Don Fargo is going to bleed. So after the video, Charlie asked Joe if he'd stay with him. He said, because Don Fargo is going to be in the opening TV match. So obviously Joe hung in there with him. And so then Fargo came to the ring, and he had his fist taped. And that's exactly what he did on the Monday night in that video that they just watched with Joe Leduc. And it always made it easier to bust somebody open if you tape your fist rather than try to do it with just your bare knuckles. I don't know what was about that made it happen, but that was the case. So Fargo, right away, as soon as he got in the ring, he threw all his attention to the set where Joe Leduc was seated, man. And he started screaming at him, and as if he wanted to, he asked him, he said, "Do you want some more today?" Right? I mean, you don't do that to Joe. And wow, that's not the right guy to do that to. So when the bell rang, Fargo went right to work on his TV opponent. And he had his fist taped, just like he did with Joe on the Monday before, and it didn't take him but 2 or 3 minutes, and he whacked the guy that he was wrestling and busted him over the left eye, and then the guy started bleeding. And then when that happened, he yelled again at Joe Leduc. He says, "This is what I'm going to do to you." Right? So, well, Joe wasn't the kind of guy, man, that wasn't going to take some type of perceived challenge to him and let it slide. So the show was going to start, man, with a bang because of this. Fargo had his opponent bleeding. He had him covered, and the guy was almost unconscious, and then he pulled him up when the referee was making the count on him. Well, that was all Joe could take, man, and he left the set, and he went barreling into the ring, man. In the TV studio, knowing Joe Leduc, they exploded, man. Wow, we're going to get to see something, And when he got there and he headed into the ring, Fargo was kind of waiting on him, man. And he caught him with a couple big right hands. It kind of staggered Joe a little bit. And then as soon as Joe got his composure back and Fargo could see that he did, Fargo just jumped out of the ring and went to the dressing room. It was right there in this TV studio that wasn't far from the dressing room door to the ring. So then, but then both of them came back after a 2-minute break to make a commercial. And Joe ended up during that 2-minute break helping Fargo's opponent, who was a young guy, back to the dressing room to try to help him out. So then the upcoming match between Leduc and Fargo, this upcoming one, is going to be a no disqualification. And after this little brief altercation that had just happened in the ring, it was probably going to be a bloody match, another bloody match, this match was in that 7-match card, halfway up the card. So you got a great match like this one coming 3 matches in. The 4th match is going to be a crazy one for sure. And in fact, that was the promise that both of those guys made during the first interview. Hey, we're going to turn it loose. Basically.
Wow. I mean, boom. This TV was... Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, basically, they let fans know that, hey, this one's going to be good. So.
Yeah, so boom, just like that, off to a roaring start. All right, so who was in the next TV segment?
Eddie Boulder. And, and Eddie Boulder, I don't know if a lot of fans know this or recognize this, but Eddie Boulder, years later, is going to become Brutus the Barber Beefcake up there for WWE or WWF, whatever it was at that point. And he was good, So he got to watch a video of Dr. Bill Irwin against Roy Lee Welch from Mobile, Alabama 4 days earlier. Eddie was sitting at the set with Charlie. And so the video showed Irwin getting the win. And then he threw the referee out of the ring, and he went and got his lariat. He came to the ring. He brought a lariat with him. He had a cowboy hat on. And as soon as he beat Roy Lee, he threw the referee out of the ring, and then he went and got his lariat, and he basically tied Roy Lee up. And he left him in the middle of the ring, tied up. So Boulder pretty much sitting there watching this, and I don't think he watched the match when it originally happened. And it's the first time he had seen what the guy was doing. And he was like, I don't know what to say, Charlie. I don't think he really knew what he was out there to see. So then Dr. Bill Irwin made his first appearance ever on Southeastern TV in the next match. And Charlie asked Boulder the same thing that basically he had asked Joe. He says, this is going to be your opponent, and would you like to stay here and see this? So Irwin, Irwin beat his TV opponent, man, in his match. And, there sits Boulder watching this. And he did the same thing he did in the video match. He took the referee, threw him over the top rope, and then he went and got his rope, and he started tying his opponent up. So Eddie Boulder's sitting there, and I guess he figured, well, I can't just sit here and watch the guy do this. So he left the set, and he went up to the ring, and they looked. They were about to go at it, and Irwin just kind of backed off, took his rope, and left. And but those were two young rising stars. These two guys are really great talents. They're going to be both of them are going to be big in the future. And we were giving fans an opportunity, and we did this all the time in Southeastern, to see some of these new wrestlers that are going to be future stars.
Oh, no doubt about it. I remember both of those guys. It was hard to believe that another Southeastern star, Eddie Boulder, who turned into Brutus the Barber Beefcake years later. So who was on the personality profile? Let's move to that.
Well, it was with two wrestlers, man. And this time it was with two wrestlers, and they were in two different studios. Charlie Platt and Tony Charles were sitting on the main profile set, and Randy Rose was in the studio by himself. So Charlie and Tony started it off on a split screen. There was a split screen shot, so you could see Rose in one room, one studio, and Charlie and Tony on the other side of the screen. And it showed that they were both obviously in two different studios. And they were going to be facing each other for the United States Junior Heavyweight belt for the fourth time the following week. This would be the fourth time they'd gone at it. And Tony had won the first title match, and he kept his belt. Rose won the belt on the second match, and then Tony Charles won it back on the third match, and then Rose, immediately after he won that match, knocked him out of the ring and stole the belt and went to the dressing room with it. And there was Rose sitting with the belt still on his lap in the second studio, right? Tony Charles gets to see it along with Charlie. So Charlie was set to watch the third title match with Tony, this match before the belt got stolen from him. But Tony saw Rose sitting there with his belt on Rose's lap, and he told Charlie, he said, I'm not going to watch this video until somebody goes and gets that belt. And he goes, if somebody doesn't go and get that belt, I'm going to go get it myself. So Charlie's like, wow, no, wait a minute here. So Charlie, this show had already been a pretty very contentious start to begin with. Basically, it had two problems in the first two matches, and I think Charlie was trying to avoid having another problem. So he asked Larry Brock, who was the referee for most television shows, and he knew he was in the dressing room probably watching the profile. He asked Larry Brock, would you please go into that studio where Randy Rose is and get Tony Charles' belt and bring it to me here on the set. Mm-hmm. So camera showed Larry Brock enter the studio, and Rose got up, and he threw the belt over his shoulder, and knowing that they could hear him in the other studio, Tony and them in the other studio, he said, you can tell Tony Charles, he goes, that he's not going to see this belt again until we meet in the next match next week. And he just went to the dressing room. So Tony went crazy. It's like, what in the heck is going on here, man? I'm the champion and I can't get my own belt. So, it had almost been a week since he won the belt and he didn't have it yet. So, he was very upset and, he had a right to be. But being the gentleman that he was, though, he agreed to stay with Charlie and to go ahead and watch this match with Randy Rose, in which he beat Rose. And, and then Rose stole the belt. So he did that. But then he told Charlie, he said, I want you to do me a favor, Charlie. I want you to tell the commissioner, Don Curtis, that if I don't get my belt back before the championship match starts with Randy Rose, and he says, and I win the match against Randy Rose, he says, I will never, ever give Randy Rose another shot at my belt.
Wow.
The studio audience popped. I mean, they loved it. This would be great. Rose don't deserve it.
Yeah, I bet they did. This has really been an extremely, very different TV show than usual so far. So set us up for the next event. Who was up next?
Well, Robert and I joined Charlie at the set, and we watched our Southeastern tag victory over not only Golden and Austin, but also against the Big C, who showed up at ringside with him for this championship match we had with him for the belts. And then he obviously had to get involved in it on the end. And Robert had beat Norvell, used his Fuller leg lock, and so we told Charlie, we didn't care what combination of those three guys we were wrestling, because we were going to come out on top. We didn't think that any combination of those three guys was going to be able to beat us ever again. So the combination of the three, Golden and the Big C, were in the next TV match. So they had decided that Golden and Big C is going to tag up and they're going to take us on. So Robert and I stayed with Charlie for comments at the set, and they wrestled a very good team. Charlie Cook and Roy Lee Welch, two good wrestlers, man. They didn't have two slouches in there, that's for sure, and they got a win over Roy Lee, but the Big C had to use his black glove to get it done.
That had to be a great TV tag match. So how about the last segment of the show?
Well, it opened with the Georgia Jawjacker, man, going to the set with Charlie. And obviously, he got a standing ovation from the studio crowd. They loved him, man. And so they watched the Jawjacker's first win, was by disqualification over the Southeastern champion, the Mongolian Stomper. And the Mongolian Stomper basically threw him over the top rope because Bob was crossing his running lights with these big right hands. And he knew he was about to lose, so he just intentionally got himself disqualified to hang on to the belt. So Charlie and the Jawjacker covered the fact that the next meeting between the two of them was not going to end that way, because there was going to be a no disqualification, and therefore, that gave the Georgia Jawjacker a great chance to become the next Southeastern champion.
All right, so how about the last TV match?
Well, the last TV match, was the Mongolian Stomper, and this time Don Carson, who had not done it since he started the managing the Stomper, had not turned him loose on the studio audience. This time he did, and wow, geez, Stomper it'd been a while since he had stampeded that crowd, and I mean, he made the best of it. Wow. He almost entirely emptied the studio. There hardly was anybody sitting on the bleachers at all by the time he got his rampage through. And then he went to the ring and he destroyed another opponent.
Okay, that TV show had almost every wrestler in the territory, I'm thinking. So what happened at the Mobile event Tuesday night, March 11th, 1980? Take us there.
Well, Roy Lee Welch started the night with a win over the Masked Avenger. Dr. Bill Irwin, he got himself another win, this time over Eddie Boulder. And again, he used his rope and he tied Boulder up and left him in the ring with his rope there. Charlie Cook and Norvell Austin, they wrestled to a very exciting 30-minute TV time limit match. What a great match, Cook and Austin. Both of those guys could really wrestle. And then in the United States Junior Heavyweight Championship match, Randy Rose brought the belt to the ring, and he got beat by Tony Charles. And this time, Tony left the ring with the belt, and he, since he had won the match, as a man of his word, he said, I'm never going to wrestle Randy Rose again for this belt. So then in the Southeastern Tag Championship match, Robert and we got so upset with the Big C trying to load his glove during the match. I mean, 4 or 5 times, that's all he wanted to do was get his glove loaded so that he could put one of us down. And so we just left the ring. After, about 20 minutes of this, and we just left the ring and went to the dressing room, and referee counted us out. So Golden and Big C, they got their hand raised, and then, it's a big roar of boos when they did. But then they realized that they couldn't win the belts on the count out. And so they were trying to get the referee to go to the dressing room and bring the belts back out here. We won the match, and he says, no, you can't win your belts on a count out. So the fans really enjoyed, man, the temper tantrum, man, that lasted after that for about 5 minutes with Golden and Big C stomping up and down and demanding they bring the belts back. We weren't going to bring the belts back or send them back for sure.
That's a great way to end a match right there. So that had to frustrate Golden and the Big C, worse than beating them in the middle of the ring. What happened? Let's go to the last match for the Southeastern belt with the Mongolian Stomper and the Georgia Jawjacker.
Well, this one was a no disqualification match, and the Big C came to the ring with the Big C, rather than Don Carson, came to the ring with the champion, the Mongolian Stomper. Obviously, Don Carson, they made an excuse. Carson was sick or whatever it was. Well, you can imagine that Don Carson denying that he always denied he was not both Don Carson and the Big C, So, and he had just wrestled in a match, the Big C. So obviously he didn't have time to change in his outfit and become Don Carson. So Big C comes out there and says, Don Carson is sick, and I'm going to be here managing the Stomper. So, how was the Big C basically going to get dressed as Don Carson after wrestling a long tag match anyway? So it was a pretty good indication to everybody that Carson was trying to put something over on everybody.
Yeah, that's a good question that neither Carson or the Big C could explain. All right, so what happened in this championship match?
Well, the Big C was no dummy. You had to say that for him. The Georgia Jawjacker was absolutely dominating the Stomper again, man. And he was obviously about to end the match. And the Big C got his Stomper, and he drug him out of the ring, and he took him to the dressing room, just like Rob and I had done in the match before. And he got his Stomper counted out. So that got the Georgia Jawjacker's hand raised, which the crowd exploded on, but it also denied him the belt and the championship. So, I'd never heard a building so inflamed, man, with heat for the heels as that. Wow, that really got fans mad at him just leaving the ring and giving the Jawjacker no chance to win the belt. So it was bad enough that the police had to stay after the matches. A lot of the crowd wouldn't leave, man. It was like a mob out there. They had to take the police, had to get the Stomper and the Big C out of the building that night.
Wow, what a great finish in 2 matches, back to back. One leaving fans really enjoying it, and the very next match with them wanting to riot, basically. So, wow, what a great way to put fantastic heat on the heels, especially when you had a guy like Don Carson trying to pull off being 2 different people. I did that in air quotes, by the way. Well, so how about the attendances on these 3 events? You had to have big numbers.
Well, Montgomery on Monday was 4,100. It was just about 200 down from what it was the week before. Dothan on Friday was 4,200. Actually, it was about 100 more. And Mobile on Tuesday night, and we were in Expo Hall. It was pretty much sold out, 5,400. Basically, it was 13,700 fans for those three events combined.
All right, good news. We have time again for another Learning Tree question. Let's go with it. This one comes from Paul Skivers in Dover, Delaware. He asked, was it easier or harder to transition from the Knoxville territory to Pensacola as it related to angles in Southeastern Championship Wrestling?
Well, that's a great question, Paul. Yeah, it was definitely much easier figuring angles in Pensacola in my second territory than it was the first territory that I owned in Knoxville. Knoxville, was my first appearance, first experience as an owner and a part-time booker. I was helping doing the booking in the first year, 74 and 75, and it was my first wrestling company. And prior to that, I'd never been a booker anywhere. I'd figured some finishes in Florida in my first years there. I was there for 4 years once I started down there. And I'd figured some finishes toward the end of that time frame, and quite a few finishes in St. Louis, Missouri, where I helped out their booker there, who was Pat O'Connor, in 1973 and 1974. So I basically started to figure some angles in 1975, which was my first full year in Knoxville, and it was my first time as a full-time booker in 1978 when I went down to Pensacola. And we opened Southeastern Gulf Coast Territory. And at that point, the Knoxville Territory had been in business for about 3.5 years. So the transition, I guess, of angles from Knoxville to Pensacola was like a no-brainer. It made things a whole lot easier. The fact that, and it also made it easier because the territories were separated by 500 miles. And obviously, you had very few fans that even knew. The people in the Gulf Coast down there didn't even know there was a Southeastern in Tennessee, and vice versa. People in Tennessee didn't know anything about the Gulf Coast Southeastern wrestling. So we duplicated the same angles many times in Pensacola that we had already been successful with in Knoxville years earlier. It made sense. Why not, man? It made it much easier as a booker to do something you knew for sure was going to be successful. We didn't do things that weren't successful that we'd tried in Knoxville. That would make no sense. So a great example of what I'm talking about is the Georgia Jawjacker angle that was happening right now in this Studcast here. We had done something very similar in Knoxville in 1977 when Bob lost to Loser Leave Town there and came back as, oddly enough, the Georgia Jawjacker. Okay? So I'm sure the Knoxville fans listening out there today, you remember those days when Armstrong had to leave and then came back under the hood as the Georgia Jawjacker. So the Southeastern Gulf Coast Territory, they had many angles of its own, that was never done in Knoxville, that the Knoxville people never even knew about. For instance, turning Bob Armstrong heel and the formation of my stud stable. That never ever happened up north. In Tennessee, neither of those two things ever happened up there. And we had never seen, the Knoxville fans never saw anything about that. Didn't know anything about that until 1985. And those two things had already been done down south, and they weren't going to get the chance. So, thanks again for your question, Mr. Skivers. This is a good question. And yes, obviously, it's much easier to transition successful angles from Knoxville to Pensacola than to build the Pensacola territory without them.
That's a great answer to that question. And you know what? Bob Armstrong could be the Bullet. He could be the Georgia Jawjacker. He could be just Bob. He was... Man, what a tremendous talent. And another tremendous Studcast. Your explanation of why and how the sport changed so dramatically in 1920, I think, was pretty amazing. I can't wait to hear how your grandfather, 100 years ago, made the transition from wrestler to promoter and owner. So what else do you have for us next week, Ron?
Well, it's going to be the third week in March, 1980, and it's going to bring Southeastern fans, obviously another great card down there. The new Dr. Bill Irwin is going to step on some mighty big toes in the next Studcast, and he's about to move up because he's going to have to. And it's going to lead to some dramatic changes in the cards going forward from this point because of what happens in next week, in the next Studcast. We'll be back, obviously, with the new TV to explain it all and the results of the card and the weekly attendances. And time permitting, hopefully, Dave, we'll have another learning tree next week.
I hope we can fit it all in there. Absolutely. Sounds like another one that is not to be missed. Hey, folks, you know the deal on Facebook. Find Ron at Ron Fuller, the Tennessee Stud. Like and follow him there. Automatically become friends with a living legend. On Twitter, now known as X, Twitter or X, he's Ron Fuller Welch. You can follow him there as well. Check out the fantastic website at tnstud.com. This Studcast is going to be there with every Studcast ever done. Shop the Stud store where you can get 43 Super Studcasts, 4 different 8x10 photos, the thrilling lion novel Brutus, personally autographed to you, and T-shirts still on sale for only $15.99, all with free shipping. Plus, subscribe now at YouTube Southeastern Rewind and get the best in old school wrestling. 405 videos, the last 118 Studcasts, 52 stud stories, 105 short rides with the stud, and coming Saturday, March 16th, Ask the Stud 15. We talked about that earlier. The question and answer show this coming Saturday. You got to check it out. All this exclusively on YouTube Southeastern Rewind. It is the best deal in old school wrestling. And another reminder, Ron is going to be in Ozark, Alabama, only a few Saturdays away. Saturday, March 23rd, actually only a couple of Saturdays away, in the Ozark Civic Center. The doors are going to open at 6. Come meet the stud, get stud merchandise, get your selfie with the stud. Ever had your picture made by a dude that's 6'9"? Check out a fun night of wrestling. And Stud, I understand you are going to be escorting somebody you're involved somehow in these matches?
Yeah, I may be, Dave. Yeah, there's a good chance I'm going to be escorting somebody down to the ring. And and I got to also plug a couple of other guys that are really, really popular. They're going to be there on that event. There's a Wildcat Wendell Cooley and Scott Armstrong are going to be there that night.
Wow.
So it's going to be something big for that Ozark area.
That's a good deal and a fun night indeed. All right. Any final comments, Stud?
Yes, sir. As usual, Dave, I want to thank everybody for their continued support and for all the great comments that we've been getting on social media. I really, really appreciate fans sending me their thoughts. And please take care of yourselves and others, and may God bless us all.
For Ron Fuller in the Great Smoky Mountains of Tennessee, I'm David Summers saying thank you for listening. Find me at David Summers Productions at gmail.com. This Studcast is a David Summers production for Tennessee Stud, LLC.
Thanks for joining us today for this historic Studcast. The true story continues next week. So full Nelson your friends and point them in our direction for another ride with the Tennessee Stud.
1, 2, 3.
This is David Summers saying so long from the Great Smoky Mountains.